Hi, this is Aryeh, and I have a very important announcement about the future of Culturally Determined. This is the final episode that will appear on the Blog Ads platform. I'm taking the show independent, so if you want to keep watching or listening, you have to subscribe to the individual YouTube channel or individual podcast feed in your favorite podcast player. Links to those things will be below on the Blog Ads site, or you can just search on YouTube or your favorite podcast app for Culturally Determined. So thanks for watching and listening for all these years, and I hope you will stick with me in the future. And I would also like to thank Blogging Heads and of course Bob Wright for hosting the show for 7 years and letting me do it to begin with. So enjoy the final episode of Blogging Heads, and I hope to see you in the future. Thanks. Hi, welcome to Culture Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Chris Novembrino. Chris, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chris Novembrino. I'm the host of Don't Worry About the Government, which is a long running news and politics podcast. It's actually been going since the late days of the Bush administration, right after Barack Obama's election. We've done 550 episodes. I was on during the Obama administration, on during the Trump administration, on during the Biden administration now. Yeah, no, it's interesting to see how time flies. And I'm also a professional musician as well.
Right. And you've had me on your show at least twice over the years, maybe
I feel
more
like it's
than
been more than that. Yeah, yeah. Like I'm a bit of an Aryeh Cohen-Wade fanboy as much
that.
as the age
Well, I
is.
appreciate that. It's a, few, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
We gotta
But
stand. We gotta stand our man.
okay, so thank you for coming on, and the topic is going to be or at least our launching off point is going to be a column that Tom Friedman, also known as Thomas L. Friedman, published in his op-ed column in the Times, and this the headline is Biden-Cheney 2024 question mark, and this every 3 or 4 weeks there's a New York Times opinion column that sets the Twitter world aflame, and this is one of them. And so both Tom Friedman's name and Biden-Cheney 2024 were trending topics on Twitter, and it was mainly because people did not like this column, and that things that people don't like, when it comes to the world of like takes, are more likely to trend because people are saying, this sucks, fuck you, go kill yourself, kind of stuff. And people generally are sick and tired of Tom Friedman and his sort of brand of center left, whatever. But I think I even didn't read the column at first because I saw the headline and I was like, whatever. But then I read it and I think it, it, it made points that the headline, and probably a lot of people always saw the headline and got mad. Um, and that's why that phrase trended. But it made points about, um, you know, current politics and the next election that I thought had some importance. And so you volunteered to come on and discuss the piece. So I'm more sympathetic to it than you are. But basically, the argument that Friedman presents is, we're at some sort of crisis moment in democracy still, and um, you need some sort of cross ideological coalition to possibly, defeat the possible 2024 candidacy of former President Donald Trump. And he uses the recent Israeli politics as an example where there was this bizarre stalemate situation in which there were four separate parliamentary elections, in which no one could assemble a coalition. It was and so Netanyahu remained in power for multiple elections. Then finally, a broad coalition united, that was essentially bound together only by not wanting Bibi Netanyahu to still be prime minister, is now in power, and that coalition ranges from um, some people on the Israeli left to Israeli Arab parties who they have a traditional stance of not participating in any governing coalition as a protest against the general Zionist project, I guess. So that it's very unusual, and includes people on the Israeli far right, also like settler politicians. Um, so Friedman wonders whether something similar could happen in America, and the key paragraph he says, I'm quoting him, says, "Is that what America needs in 2024? A ticket of Joe Biden, Liz Cheney, or Joe Biden and Lisa Murkowski, or Kamala Harris and Mitt Romney, or Stacey Abrams and Liz Cheney, or Amy Klobuchar and Liz Cheney, or any other such combination? Before you leap into the comments section, hear me out." And then he makes his argument. Okay, did I sum up his essential case, or at least his
Oh,
essential
I
case?
think you did. I
Well,
think you did a fine job, and I think, I mean, kind of in your framing, we can see the issue with this article and sort of its argumentative form. I think there are sort of two discrete things. There's the question of, is the Israel example really relevant and useful? It does appealing to a parliamentary system that has a completely different electoral process actually make your argument stronger or better when you're talking about the American system, or does it make you seem more out of touch? I'd argue to the latter. But let's start with the first premise here of American democracy being seriously under some sort of threat, if not from Trump, from small d anti-democratic forces. That there's a new appeal to an anti-democratic mode of politics, whether it's using the Supreme Court, whether it's trying to find little loopholes in the electoral system where you can defeat the popular vote using parliamentary tricks. I think that question's very salient, and I think that I tend to agree with him that like there is a real problem, and there is a real problem that necessitates a new and different kind of response. Friedman's response here, I think, and his answer is the same old tired answer that we seem to have been getting for our entire lives, right? It's we just need a Democrat and a Republican to come together, put differences aside. I mean, I saw this in the plot of My Fellow Americans with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. Like you get the
so
Democrat and the
when did that movie come out? Like the late '90s?
the late 90s, right? Like this is the narrative you and I have been getting our entire lives, that like a good Democrat and a good Republican need to just kind of cut through the Gordian knot of the system and come together. And oh, by the way, when that happens, Americans will be ecstatic about this. There won't be any cynicism towards Joe Biden and Liz Cheney, or an Amy Klobuchar and Liz Cheney, or Kamala Harris and Liz Cheney, or Kamala Harris and Mitt Romney. America will be like, I wasn't so sure about Mitt Romney. I didn't vote for him back in the day. I'm not so sure about Kamala Harris. But when you put them together, I think that that's the big failure of a lot of this sort of brand centrism's imagination, is that I think they've rightly identified a real problem here. We have a two-party system in this country, unlike Israel, and this is actually where I think the Israel like analogy is particularly unuseful. In Israel, you have like multiple factions, and you can cobble together a parliamentary coalition in a number of different ways. There are dominant parties and less dominant parties, so there's more likely outcomes, but there's a wide range of outcomes. In America, you get two. You get the
Right.
Democratic Party, or you get the Republican Party. And what Friedman and others seem to be saying, without kind of fully committing to it, is that like essentially you can't let the Democratic, or you can't let the Republican Party back into power. And if that's the case, then there's really only one vehicle in town right now, and it's the Democratic Party, not some other weird imagined third lane.
Yeah, and so yeah, there. I mean, Friedman acknowledges the problems with his sort of metaphor, and he has this trope that he brings up at the beginning of the piece, which he refers to the fact that he has used this before, which is Middle Eastern politics are off Broadway, American politics are Broadway. Things start in the Middle East, and then 10 or 20 years later we see them in the West. I think that's not it's a stupid metaphor, and he's often bad at metaphors. But I think it there's a salient point here. I mean, American politics has become more like Middle Eastern. We invaded Iraq, and we sort of like absorbed we absorbed something about like the just that a more tribal mindset. I mean, maybe it's just a total coincidence, but American politics is more sort of either our side if our side doesn't win, we're all going to die, like that, like everyone sort of believes that now, and that's sort of like the kind of politics that like led to the Lebanese civil war. It's like our tribe has to defeat the other tribes, or the other tribes are going to murder us all. And he brings up like airline hijacking, building walls, suicide bombings, other things that started in the Middle East and then spread to the West. So that's the metaphor. Yeah, there's obvious problems. The Knesset, there's like 25 parties in the Israeli parliament. There's
I also just think a
there's all
lot
these
of like
tiny
political
little
trends are
ideological
globally
parties.
linked, right? Like we have, I mean, there's a great account that I follow called Populism Updates that gives you like updates about different populists all over the world.
Hmm.
And you can see like MAGAism is currently traveling all around the world. That you have MAGA types in Argentina. You don't even
Right.
have to change the acronym or anything like that. I mean, so I just like I think insofar as Israeli politics has had an impact in American politics, I think it's a bit overstated by Friedman here, but I think maybe the biggest kind of clear line is Netanyahu's outsized influence in the American system. I remember when Netanyahu like did this whole stunt where he like snubbed Obama by doing his speech to the Senate that John Boehner and Mitch McConnell were willing to welcome, and I mean like
Yeah.
insofar as I think like anything really got imported into the United States, it was maybe a little bit of a streak of Netanyahuism
Yeah, I mean,
among the political
Netanyahu is,
class.
and Friedman says this, Netanyahu is kind of like the competent, intelligent version of Trump. And it's possible to say who is the most successful global politician of the past 20 years. Like, you could say it's Netanyahu just because he's managed to stay in office and like avoid, seemingly he can't be killed, and then seemingly possibly is finally defeated. Although just today there was news that he might, the whole thing with him seems to be he was staying in office primarily because there's a law that like a sitting minister can't be indicted, and then he's like charged with various crimes, related to graft and stuff like that. So it seems like he's close to doing a plea deal that would like bar him for like 7 years from elected office. So then maybe he can make a comeback in 7 years when he'd be like 79 years old. Anyway, Netanyahu has been able to cling to power in a way that Trump hasn't, but also has this angle of like, he could just be indicted for you know um common, political a corruption and
I
end up in
think in
jail. And
that sense he's
that
close,
actually
but
happens in Israel. Ehud Barak, not Ehud Barak, the prime minister was after Barak, whose name is escaping right now, did go to jail. An American president's never go to jail. In Israel, the prime minister, if he committed a crime, can end up in jail. So Daniel is his like personal freedom is threatened. Anyway, basically, reason I thought this column was interesting and people were shitting on it too much was like there's a Netanyahu is a threat to the project of a Zionist and democratic Israel, my opinion as an American Jew. Um, the project of Zionist democracy is both younger and weaker and maybe has more inherent flaws than the project of like American Republican democracy. But is Trump a similar threat to American democracy such that we need to do something, and maybe like there needs to be some sort of like popular front or grand coalition or something to oppose him in the way that this crazy coalition involving Arab political parties and West Bank settlers all came together to just be like, this Netanyahu guy, he is a threat to the entire project. We need to kick him out. Yes, there's a lot of problems. One is multi-party versus two-party, and like there's all coalition politics are super complicated in Israel, and so you can never have there's not like a swing party or something that could come in and move the needle. The other, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of ways that the metaphor doesn't quite make sense. But the reason I like this column stuck with me really is like if he had written this column like January 10th, 2021, you could say like, okay, like Trump has been proven, basically everyone agrees that like this guy needs to get out of here and is a horrible person and never come back. And something that has surprised me is that the GOP has stuck with Trump and basically assimilated this idea that the election was stolen from him, which is plainly false. And it's like the big lie. And I've talked about this on the show before that like calling this the big lie is an insult to, like the Nazi big lie that led to contributed to the Holocaust. But
I used to really resist the phrase "the big lie," but I've got to be honest. Now that we are like nearly a year and a half into the stop this, like Trump
yeah,
really won
the
the
lie has
election.
gotten bigger or something.
It's such a large lie that I like when someone goes, "It's the big lie." I'm like, Yeah, I don't love that, but you're not wrong. Like it's this massive sustained push of a lie. I got a phone call from a Republican pollster about a week and a half ago, and I just sort of like faked my way along because I wanted to see what they were talking about
Uh-huh.
these days. I'm in Texas, baby. Like
Right, right.
I'm in Texas, and my name's Kansas, potentially a Republican voter. And I'm on the phone with them, and we got into the "Do you think the election was stolen?" thing, and I was like, "Yeah, I do." And I just kind of leaned into it. And I just wanted to see what the pollster said, and they were goading me on. They were like, "No, I think it was stolen too." I mean, like this is. They had a number of questions that were like push questions about the stolen election, and then they basically were encouraging me as I said, "Oh, I think this election was stolen."
Okay,
They
so
said
this
Trump was
was more like a push poll than a legit polling
no,
out.
I think it was a little bit of both.
Okay.
I honestly no, because it was about the Republican primaries. They were asking me a question about all the different random people running for judge and that sort of
Oh,
thing.
okay.
But yeah, then we then got into heavily on the do you think the election was stolen? And yeah, like
Right. So if you had asked me 10 months ago, like, would they still be using would the GOP have coalesced around this line that Trump was the election was unfairly stolen from him? I would have said no. Like, that's crazy. Like, did you see what happened on January 6th? Like, this is, like tragic farce.
you would have expected them to quietly back away into the hedge, like that Homer Simpson meme.
Yeah, and Trump himself is such a fucking like dumbass and annoying person that everyone actually like everyone in power and who encounters him actually hates. They had the perfect chance. They came as close to impeaching and convicting a president as has happened in American history, but they came about 10 votes short or something like that. So they could have cut him off at the knees and prevented him from ever running again, and they chose not to. So that's on the GOP. And but it's like
And
it is
shortly
it just
after
like it
that,
is. Okay, so then it's like, is Trump a threat? Is Trumpism a threat? Is there something that is Trump is like Trump himself is going to shuffle off this mortal coil I'm dropping the Shakespeare references, Fast and Furious. He's going to die at some point, like inshallah, sooner rather than later. And then there's no like Don Jr. can't take over, and DeSantis is not quite the same figure, and JD Vance isn't going to do it either. And Tucker Carlson is probably too smart to want to actually try it. And so there's no like heir to the throne. It's such a cult of personality. So he's going to leave at some point, and then it's not like like the fascist, like the next fascist leader kind of thing would take over. And often fascism was much more cult of personality than like other authoritarianisms of the 20th century. Kind of rambling here, but I just think what is Trump slash Trumpism some sort of continuing threat to to American democracy, even after he plainly lost, and it wasn't that close in 2020, and his deranged followers stormed the Capitol and made giant fools of themselves on January 6th. Surprisingly, it's more than I would have thought. He
no,
just keeps going.
I think the answer is clearly yes. And I'm with you, like on all the basic premises here. Like Trump is unique in the sphere. There's no one who's clearly, at least apparently, as we are talking right now, poised to grab the mantle. But if you had talked to either one of us in early 2015 and you'd said Donald Trump was going to wrangle control of the Republican Party with like sort of like a B-level parody of a Republican politic, I wouldn't have believed you. If you taught me late December 2014, I would have
Right.
been like, really, that guy's going to speak to the zeitgeist of the party. So I think we should always be careful when we go, well, there's no one clearly ready to take the mantle after Trump that we know of right now. But that person is out there. And I don't know who they are. I can't even speak to them, but they do exist. And so what you have to worry about is a pump that is primed when it comes to Trump. And I mean, watching the events of January last year, I was pretty preoccupied with them. I thought this is an important moment, unfortunately, in our country's history, and it became pretty clear very quickly that one, the Republican Party was not going to cut ties with Trump, and the Democratic Party and the media were not going to actually change the way that they approached the Republican Party, the media in terms of coverage, and the Democratic Party in terms of what values they tout. I mean, immediately after January 6th, there was already talk about bipartisanship again and a need to work together from Biden and the Democrats. That scared me. the media coverage of the Republican Party very quickly just reverted back to normalcy. That scares me. That alarms me. And so like I do see threats to the democracy in the sense that, largely speaking, people are pretending that January 6th was just a really bad day, and maybe if like we really pretend like it'll be a thing we can laugh about, but didn't really happen, and didn't really mean anything, and we shouldn't put too much stock into it. And
Right.
I
I
think
mean,
I think denying it's one of the biggest threats to our democracy right now.
yeah, I mean, it's weird. There's people, like it's sort of like they flooded the zone. There's people out there who believe that like, oh, this was actually like a false flag instigated by the FBI. There's people who believe like actually it was Antifa who was doing it. There's people who believe, oh, these are just like jokers and fools. I mean, I basically think they're jokers and fools, but and managed to pull off this, absurd feat.
I used to think that too, but now what I realize is there are jokers and fools, and then there are actually savvy operators who are operating within the morass of the jokers and fools. And that jokers and fools shouldn't be so easily dismissed because they serve as human camouflage.
Right. And it's hard to, and I've said this on the show before, if like, one of the big unanswered questions is of January 6th is why it was, the preparations on the Capitol Police were so poor. And if they had, if the if they had assembled with their riot shields and full armor and stuff beforehand and had like 3 or 4 times as many people there, then probably like the breaching wouldn't have happened. Maybe it would have been more violent or something, but you know it was bizarrely ill prepared, and whether that was through total incompetence or something more sinister, I think is still unknown. I usually assume incompetence when it comes to the government as opposed to something sinister, but so that is a question that needs to be answered. But so yeah, so they were jokers and fools, but they had been convinced of something by people who
And then you
you
have
know
like real intellectuals, like the guy from the Claremont Institute explaining how to like actually steal the election step by step during this. I mean, like they
right.
really put like an
And then,
intellectual skeleton behind all of this
there's
stuff.
an interesting thing that I saw. There was some guy who was in the Trump administration, and maybe even that guy who was like, what is his name? I can't remember, but there's a case to be made that that the riot actually undermined the legal maneuvering coup attempt. Like if the riot never happened, then it would have been easier for them because the riots freaked everyone the fuck out. And so if the riot didn't happen, then maybe the legal maneuvering they could have had a better shot at actually pulling it off. And
I,
so maybe they were even working. Everyone is so absurd, stupid that they worked at cross purposes. So that is a
I know what
possibility
you're
also.
talking about, and I remember reading that and thinking, oh, so their takeaway from January 6th was do it again, but do it less Trumpy. And that's scary,
But
dude.
by
And
do
this,
it again, you mean the legal insider legal maneuvering?
yeah,
Like try that again?
keep trying to work it. Keep trying to work the rest. Legal insider maneuvering. Throw out the stage. Schmoz it
Right.
up. Yeah, like always schmoz. Like you have not lost. You have not lost until you have lost the last court case. In January of the following year.
Yeah, and I mean, if once QAnon shaman was in the well of the Senate, it became a lot more embarrassing for sort of like the marginal, like Trump sympathetic, GOP congressman to try to gum up the works, and that's why like the entire thing that they wanted to do of objecting like state by state like very quickly unraveled, even though like 130 Republicans ended up voting for this thing like that. It quickly fell apart. And so, as is often the case in America, like a group of people try to do something and it ends up just like completely backfiring, and the opposite of what they wanted to do is intended. Like you know people protesting against the police ends up making the police more popular. Like this just seems to happen over and over again in
I,
America.
Yeah, no, and so like now let's fast forward to a year later where we had the 1 year anniversary of January 6th. And like I think that serves as its own little commentary to the way that the country is, or in the political class specifically, is or is not processing this, right? The Republicans don't even want to be in the room. At this point, they're so all in on the idea that like this wasn't actually that bad. That they're not even in to observe it or do any of those sorts of ceremonies. Meanwhile, the Democrats, for their part, have gotten a hold of the director of Hamilton so that he can come on and sing a special song from the play to commemorate this day.
That was truly bizarre. Yeah, it's like
It was truly no, but it was bizarre, but it's fitting with the same sort of Democratic Party that looks at police brutality on their television set and goes, "Let's get some kente cloth and do a photo op."
yeah,
And I think, I mean, to me, when Friedman's talking about the issues of like fascism and this sort of like failure of the loss of the center, right? And this need for the center to come together and be strong. I don't think there's ever a real forensic analysis of how things like the Hamilton guy, the Kenta Claus, stuff like that leaves people cold. And that's so much, yeah, so
yeah,
much of
and
this stuff is not actually speaking to people. And that's how the center lost people.
yeah, that I mean, they were like the whole sort of memorial aspect of the first anniversary, like you know, I mean, there were so many things that were deeply stupid about it. So one was that there were people on the right who were saying like, let's not politicize this tragedy. Like, okay, this was not, like this was a political event, start to finish. So like that makes no sense. At the other end, it's like even some people on the liberal left side were sort of treating this like this like there was an earthquake or something and a bunch of people died in the earthquake and so we're going to sing a song to commemorate the people who died in the earthquake. Like that doesn't make any sense either. I mean, the side note that well, I'm sure was not intended and no one else got, probably a few people got. So I'm a big Hamilton person. The song, I don't know why they chose this song, "Dear Theodosia," which is the song that Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton sing to their newborn children, hoping that this new country they're creating for them is going to enable them to like live better lives free of the violence that they just experienced as Revolutionary War soldiers. In fact, both Theodosia Burr and Philip Hamilton die violent deaths. And Burr ends up killing the older Hamilton. So there's a deep irony within the song once like Theodosia was like killed by pirates, and Philip Hamilton, was killed in a duel, like his father later would be. So I think there's a layer of irony within this song, but that was totally absent of just having people on Zoom singing it. Totally bizarre. They don't. Nancy Pelosi is a good inside operator, but doesn't has very the Kente Claw thing was probably her as well, and that was an embarrassment.
Well, these people are supposed to be the center, right? Like effectively, I mean, running with like the Freeman sort of framing, Biden is the eminent centrist Democrat. Pelosi is, I know she gets presented as a liberal and like the Republican boogeymanning of this, but she's the consummate insider, is actually pretty centrist, especially when you're talking about Wall Street sorts of policies. She's like, pretty right. She's like pro the insider trading and everything.
Right.
These people are supposed to be serving as the political center, and they are failing. But you don't see Friedman lobbying a meaningful critique at Biden and Pelosi and sort of like the feckless Democrats. I mean, the idea of Joe Biden and Liz Cheney running together sort of supposes that Joe Biden has really actually captured the national imagination of people.
Well, okay, but so this is where I think in some ways whatever clever editor put Biden-Cheney 2024 pissing everyone off. He basically he throws out all these different options. Like 85% of them include Liz Cheney because there's not that many other people he could possibly stick with. But yeah, so I think that is absurd. And then I guess
we need to talk about Liz Cheney too.
Well, the fact was that
right?
Liz Cheney and her elderly father, who I believe is named Dick Cheney, were the only two Republicans in the House chamber or whatever to observe this memorial. Then included the Hamilton clip, and I looked up, and Dick Cheney actually used to be vice president. And a lot of Democrats were coming up and like shaking his hand and stuff. And so Dick Cheney, like in a just world, would probably be in The Hague. And so it's like
Mitt Romney couldn't even be bothered. That's right. Cheney and Liz and Dick showed up, but Mitt Romney couldn't even get himself to that event.
Right. But it's also sort of like, well, you go to war with the army you have, to quote another relic of the
All right,
Bush
so
administration.
running with that metaphor, what kind of soldier is Liz Cheney then? What utility is specialist Liz Cheney?
Right, but I mean, the part of the reason Trump was able to rise was that the GOP was so the metaphor I used was like Trump was an infection and the GOP was someone who had cancer, like rotting their bones, but it wasn't immediately obvious, and only like the reason the infection worked was because the cancer had grown so deep. So like there's no like good Republicans left, um, who you could appeal to. Like they're all tainted in various ways, and Liz Cheney is very hawkish, and I guess like is sort of a profile in courage because she could like lose her job by she could just stay silent or something, but she's obviously like does either really believes this or sees some angle in doing it, but it seems more like she probably believes it because she's probably going to get primaried and no longer be in Congress anymore because she's become so anti-Trump. But it's just like, yeah, we're stuck with these horrible people on the GOP who don't like Trump. It's like it's a really shitty.
Like how? So you just brought up Cheney and that she's going to get primary. She's not going to be out there. Like this is another problem for Friedman's whole argument. The whole reason you would grab a Liz Cheney is because Liz Cheney has some sort of popularity base that
but
is
she doesn't. Yeah.
She doesn't, right? And I'm
she
with
has
you
an
on,
elite. There's people in the elite like her, but there's
right,
no
right. That's and like that's sort of the problem with modern centrism, right? Like that modern centrism is really a politics of the elite, and like on and there's like sort of a narrative here. Like editorial centrism sort of thinks about this idea that like voters ultimately listen to what the Republicans say and the Democrats say, and they go, oh, well, he's got a point, she's got a point, and they land somewhere in the middle. Whereas I think like an alternative narrative of centrism, like an understanding political centrists in this country who vote, the swing voting independents, is that like look at the polls. They're motivated usually by too little information and late breaking information rather than too much information. And because of too much information, a need to create a synthesis composite position. They just get blown. They end up blown by the winds of politics,
right.
to be clear. And they land somewhere in the middle of the political valence.
Yeah, the swing the swing voter is not like someone who cares deeply about like balancing the budget but also gay rights. It's someone who has like doesn't pay attention to politics, has like weird beliefs that don't make sense, but it doesn't matter because they're just a normal person who is going on with their life. And then like when the election comes, yeah, they're just like, oh, I guess I should vote, and they're not like poring over like policy documents.
They might be
just, like,
voting on the gold standard, is what I'm saying. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
they're-
you
either
guy
they-
goes there, well, the Republicans probably going to bring back the gold standard.
Yeah, or maybe even they are voting the gold standard and they think the Democrats are going to bring back. Like it's probably just ill-informed people who just probably for reasons that make sense to them just don't pay attention to this stuff because who cares? Yeah, so that and Liz Cheney definitely does not command a like 1/10 of the GOP. Like I mean she won in Wyoming, and so she's like the at-large representative of Wyoming, but she's like clearly does not represent like more than 50% of the Wyoming GOP, and so she's gonna get primaried and lose, I assume. Who knows?
Look at the rest of the people on Thomas Friedman's dream team list, though. They're not exactly political dynamos. I don't see a Barack Obama on this list. You got Kamala Harris, whose poll numbers stink and have stunk, and they stunk during the primaries and they stink now. You got Joe Biden, a guy who limped his way through the primaries, and his poll numbers have not really been where he would want them to be during this presidency. You got Amy Klobuchar, a person who failed to break double digits. I mean, you're looking at a lot of people who are duds. I notice that Friedman doesn't want to like do any sort of business with Bernie, for example, here. But if you were actually, and who's the one guy in the Democratic coalition who seems to have a little bit of crossover appeal with the right wing, and we can speculate as to why or whatever, but Bernie Sanders is that guy. I mean, I literally saw a car on Twitter earlier that had "Let's Go Brandon" and a Bernie Sanders bumper sticker on it. like if you were actually going to try to create this coalition, rather than have AOC go and get coffee for Amy Klobuchar and Liz Cheney, like Thomas Friedman basically proposes, like you would actually be using AOC, who's unbelievably popular. You'd actually be using Bernie Sanders, who had a huge fan base, and still very much has the imagination of the youth. I mean, you'd be, and like not them exclusively, but they would be really important messengers. And to that point,
yeah. So there's a line in there where Freeman says something like, in his imagined grand coalition, like AOC would have to like, bite her tongue and put some of her preferred policies on the shelf to save American democracy.
For Liz Cheney and boost
Yeah,
Liz Cheney. It's not the other way around, right? It's not Liz Cheney going and saying, you know what, AOC is actually good, and a lot of the stuff you've been hearing your whole life about her has been crap. No, it's the other way around, where AOC has to go around and go like, Liz Cheney, yeah, no, she's great, we like her. I mean, there's just like a lot of like built-in biases here, and I just, as I think about the team that Friedman wants, I don't see them actually capturing people's imagination. Largely speaking, too, the only people who know Amy Klobuchar are columnists. People like you and me know who Amy Klobuchar is, but like the run of the mill swing voting independent probably has no idea who Amy Klobuchar is. If we got 100 of them,
yeah, yeah. So okay, yeah, I mean the people who he proposes on the right are the aforementioned Liz Cheney, and then Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney, both of whom, I guess they both voted for impeachment, so they get a pat on the back for that, but are otherwise more or less. I guess Murkowski maybe a little bit
Murkowski
more.
voted against Kavanaugh, and Manchin voted for Kavanaugh, so I like Murkowski more
Yeah,
than
and
him.
Romney, I think actually does have some sense of like dignity or something, or
He
like
has moments that are not bad. I'll give him that.
yeah, but yeah, it's a pretty, it's a thin bench to draw from for this Imagine Grand Coalition. Okay, so let's see. So
Well, and
let's
again, the whole idea is a popular front, right? Like if you're going to have a popular front, the front has to be popular.
yeah, good point. And actually, I mean that. Well, we can talk just a little bit about. I mean, so I'm thinking of the unpopular front, and that's the name of the Substack that the writer John Gans does. And I've had John on this show before, and he wrote an interesting post. We don't need to talk about it extensively, but there's been a running debate: is Trump a fascist or not? How did January 6th affect our view of that? He tries to maybe draw somewhat back from the idea of fascism, which is of course very historically loaded, and he calls it Caesarism, and also looks at things that happened in France, like in the 1880s or something, and various like other movements that maybe were sort of proto-fascistic, and comparing it to Trump and Trumpism, and drawing, what can we say once we say that Trump is not Hitler? Like, where do we classify his ideology? I mean, I've been saying for a long time that like Trump can't be a fascist because he has no ideology and he just like believes in himself. I still basically believe that, and it's the cult of personality aspect has only increased since he lost the election, because all it basically is about is like getting him back into office. Is no like they barely talk about policy, or that we're going to finish the wall or anything like that. Like it's just like put the big man back in the Oval Office. So well, anyway, we'll link to this piece, and it takes a serious look at these things. I mean, Gans himself is a leftist, and I think so the idea of the popular front, I think, was like the socialists and the communists, putting their differences aside to fight against the fascists, and often that didn't work because the socialists and the communists decided they'd rather fight against each other, and then the fascists were able to defeat them both. And I mean, he notes, which I think is kind of right, that like the left, the liberals' response to January 6th is epitomized by the Hamilton Zoom musical, and then the left doesn't really have a strong response, and I think there's various reasons for that. But
It serves as a damning critique of them, though. I don't know if that's where you're going, but that's kind of where I'm at. That there have been a number of discrete points over the last 4 or 5 years where the left's basic approach, like kind of like the more Brooklyn coastal left sort of approach to this big podcast, that sort of thing, has been to be too cool for school for all this stuff. That these things happen and they're cool. They got their jokes and they got the other things, and all of us who are like maybe actually kind of worried that we're gonna have an election and gets overturned, us squares out here, like, yeah, no, don't get me wrong, I roll my eyes at the liberals and like Pelosi and all, like we were just bashing them, but like I also think that if you want to actually go like, no, those guys are clowns, here's the right way to process this, actually present an alternative thing, and you lose traction with other people. I mean, like for me, I check out when I go, I think it's a big deal. When someone goes, well, I don't think it's a big deal at all. I think you're overreacting. I'm like, okay, cool. That's neat. I just not listening anymore to
mhm.
what you say.
Yeah, I mean, I I mentioned this immediately after January 6th that like I think some people on the left were sort of like more, far left were sort of like um embarrassed that like there was an American storming of the Bastille and it happened with MAGA people instead of like the proletariat uniting as one to, topple the capitalist oligarchy or something. Like, there finally was some sort of, popular uprising of sorts that
Well, right, and it served as a
invaded.
rebuke of their whole "how bad can this really get" guys sort of approach for 4 years, right? Like the storming of the Capitol is pretty freaking bad
Yeah,
at
so
long
either so I
last.
mean, it's hard, it's complicated because it was like farcical and serious at the same time, and disentangling these things is hard. And so if we're thinking like Chapo Trap House as the epitome of the like sneering Brooklyn left or something, I don't know exactly what they say about January 6th, but they're probably just making fun of them as they, many people deserve to be
I,
made fun of, and laughing at it. But um and then probably mocking the maudlin liberals, shedding a tear,
and
et cetera,
in
et
its
cetera.
own way, I think that does as big of a disservice to actually processing the event as sort of like the Friedman. Well, the Republicans did a really bad thing on that day, but also we got to remember sometimes liberalism goes too far, guys. I basically view that as the mirror image, and so like when I'm reading Robin's article here, and he's talking about the communists and the socialists not being able to come together to form a popular front, and I'm looking at the American left and like the liberal establishment's sort of two ways of being wrong and processing this discrete event. I'm like, yeah, no, I can totally see how this scans here. In terms of fascism, it's never been a word I've ever been fond of and using with regards to Trump. I get that it's like too tempting to not use, kind of like the right's obsession with socialism and communism. It's just like right there and you just want to go for it. But I think like fascist has been like, it's like a vague term too. I tend to always use the Mussolini perfect merger of the corporation and the state thing. And when I think of Trump through that prism, it does nothing. Um, and to your point
Because
earlier, I think
most of corporate America was like, they were probably were happy about the tax cuts and the lack of regulation, but they were embarrassed by him, and
and they
certainly
got what they
after
want out
January
of Biden
6th.
too. Yeah, they're getting what they want out of
Yeah,
Biden
yeah,
too.
they're
Yeah.
perfectly fine with Biden. Yeah,
So
so
I think to your point, no. Here, one last thought here is. So I think you're right when you say Trump's not a fascist. And I think if we think about his ideology, you're basically right too. Where like he doesn't really have like it's like a reaction thing, right? Like it's like I just want to get back in office, bro. Like we got it's kind of the genius of the big lie is that it actually allows him to have one singular policy, which is correct the grievous error that happened 4 years ago, rather than actually have a policy position. But I think this is where I think the fascism discussion often kind of falls short. You have Trump and his rootlessness and the type of people that Trump attracts who seem to very clearly have some sort of ideology guiding them.
yeah, I mean, there were people who were willing to die for Donald Trump on January 6th, and some of them did die for Donald Trump on January 6th. And a more competent demagogue, and it would probably require more dire circumstances in the country. Of course, the pandemic is continuing, and maybe that if there's some sort of second economic crash, you know, there were people willing to sort of be the shock troops of some sort of, like conservative popular street violence. Again, at the same time, like the whole thing was like this fucking joke, and if the cops had been well prepared and weren't wearing like bike helmets, then they would have easily repelled these morons more or less. Like I'm so it's it's hard to say, but I don't know. I mean, there's people willing to die for Donald Trump, who's a deranged former game show host. Some sort of emergent figure coming out somehow. Who isn't a total narcissistic fool. Could harness this energy, and I think that is sort of what the essay Gans's essay, which is called "What is Trumpism?" in case I didn't mention that, is sort of getting at, like, you know, yeah, what the things that the man seemed to represent. Is could some other person pick up this banner and run with it? Like at the same time, Trump's. I don't know. Like a lot of people who attract a cult of personality are unusual people, and have like idiosyncratic views or personalities or something, such that they seem sort of like jokers at one point, then I'm sure Mussolini seemed pretty absurd before he marched on Rome.
Going back to that Twitter account I mentioned earlier, populism updates. You actually, if you follow that, especially when you have no frame of reference, you will see these random politicians, oftentimes right wing, and they look very goofy and zany looking. And I used to chuckle at them, and I have now learned better because that's part of the act. Having the big crazy hair, the weird gaudy leather jacket, the strange beard, the questionable like weird oversized glass, like that's Boris Johnson's disheveled hair that he deliberately dishevels. Those are all part of the act, and I think like it's a big stark contrast. It's like the central casting thing, right? On the right, they have now kind of casted with those sorts of characters. Meanwhile, the Democratic, like left establishment, the center establishment's these boring older people in suits with no personalities. And especially when you are going to an electorate that's not getting good information on a regular basis, you've got the bombastic person and the boring person. They're going to bias towards the bombastic person more often than they bias towards the boring person. The boring person is going to be a choice when the bombastic person falls short. And that's where I think the centrist, I mean, like looking at Friedman's thing, I mean, you don't get much more boring than Amy Klobuchar. She had one joke. She had one joke and she kept telling it over and over again throughout the entire campaign. A guy like Donald Trump would eat her lunch.
That well, that would be an interesting contrast. It's hard to imagine it. And I mean, Trump is like, you know, decline. Like his decline continues. Actually, I saw a clip from his rally maybe it was even last night, and it seemed. I mean, it was only like a 30-second clip or something, but he's saying like, they say the big lie. You know what? They're the big lie. It's just like he seems sort of tapped out. Like he doesn't quite have the juice that he once did. He's a year older, as we all are, and he probably is not keeping his mind as agile when he's just sort of golfing all day.
Wordle is right there, Don. Wordle is right there. Everyone's doing it.
Yeah, but I'm that way. Yeah, his comment. If you were still on Twitter, he might be posting his Wordle grids. But yeah, so I think Trump is continuing to fade. Of course, Biden is fading in various ways as well. Someone has to win. I don't think it's going to be Trump. And I posted on the blog his forum. I think he's more likely to be in prison than the Oval Office in 2025. Still,
I think he can win the nomination, but I think winning the nomination and winning the presidency are two vastly different things. And I mean, like right now, he seems poised to just completely sweep the nomination. But like, yeah, no, I'm with you. I think that's all fine and dandy. And then we have to relitigate the Trump presidency again. And for as frustrated as people are with Biden, I think rethinking about a second run with Donald Trump should give people pause.
I would think so. Yeah, and I mean, you know, I mean, Trump analyzing Trump's psychology in some way is sort of a mug's game because he's so bizarre. But the things he's doing, like this, I don't know if you say it SPAC or if you say SPAC, the sort of it's like this.
SPAC. It's SPAC.
Okay, yeah, it's like this investment vehicle to sort of like um, create a shell company that investors can pump money into before the anything actually exists. So he's doing something like this. It's like a media company that is like his challenge on Twitter. It seems like a total scam. Well, like that's the sort of thing you do when you just want to make more money, which is one of his essential goals. Like that's not like going to Iowa and like shaking hands at the fair or something. Like it seems like he's moved on to other grifts. The SPAC thing, like billions of dollars are pouring into it. You know, I think he's probably cares more about that than he actually cares about being president.
I think
Anyway,
that's right. But let us remember how his first presidential run sort of started. He was like in the middle of a contract negotiation and basically was just using the presidential campaign as a way of
right.
leveraging. And then it took off. I think what Trump learned over the 4 years, and you saw this like I followed the Mueller report pretty close. This is another thing that unfortunately nothing happened on. But I was following that pretty closely. One thing you kind of get when you're like reading kind of the blow by blow and stuff is like Trump's people started to realize that a presidential campaign is a pretty dope business, actually. That like you can actually do a lot of things, and like you don't actually make a product. Like they're you have a lot of the trappings of a business, but without like any of the expectations of a business, and like they just give you money. Like they literally just give you the money to
Right.
like be you. Like it's pretty awesome actually. So I could totally see Trump running again, not wanting to win the nomination again, and winning the nomination again.
Yeah, another
Yeah,
accidental, another like producer's theory kind of thing of he's trying to fail, and was again
there's too
possible.
much. There's too much money. I guess another way of looking at this is why would he leave the money on the table and not run again?
Well, if he can get this, SPAC thing, apparently it's being investigated by the SEC. But if that doesn't fall
You think
apart,
that's really
then
going to hold for 4 years? That SPAC deal is going to fall apart within
I don't
36
know. I
months.
mean, he is. I mean, he's the most successful con artist in human history. In my view. So he probably has something else up his sleeve. Um, and but it's hard to predict, and we're 3 years away from the presidential election, and he might drop dead. Although I think both of his parents lived like to 95 or older, so he has good genes, as he likes to say. Yeah, I mean, I just to reiterate my point, I do think that the sort of like quote unquote big lie, the term I don't like is turning out to be more of a threat to American democracy than I thought it was. And they're really sticking with this thing, and the moronic GOP base is slobbering up or slobbering and gulping down the slop, and like they love it, and it seems like that is now part of the GOP catechism is that you have to believe that the election was stolen, and um, everything rolls from there. So that is, a lie that is, to satisfy one man's demented ego. Um, and yeah, so something there, I think the threat is more than I would have guessed, even like after, January 7th, 2021, when the crazy rioters had been repelled. Like the GOP is just so craven and
And,
has
and for
fallen in
me,
line.
it's this last year of watching Joe Manchin basically saying we need to go and work with them. And the sort of media coverage around Joe Manchin as a guy like being like, oh yeah, no, he gets it. Manchin for his own part never acts like there was really anything wrong with January 6th. Never acts like there was any like if this guy was really a leader, he could have actually been the guy like spearhead a bunch of reforms after January 6th, bring the Republicans to the table, all that sort of thing. I to me, the continued threat to democracy is that there have been no reforms put in place. The general mood towards the Republican Party in both the media coverage and among Democratic leadership is the same still. That, like, okay, Ted Cruz is a jerk, but he's in Senate. What are you going to do? Josh Hawley's a jerk, but he's in the Senate. What are you going to do? Rather than like going like, no, actually, there are certain things you can do in this life that once you do it, you've gone too far. Ted Cruz saying, I want to go and defend the Stop the Steal narrative before the Supreme Court on January 5th. Josh Hawley inciting on the protesters. Go
Yeah,
get them, guys.
I
Like
actually,
you,
yeah,
yeah, you
I
cross certain lines.
I re-listened to the episode that I taped like January 8th, 2021 with Bill Black. And one of the things I to sort of see how my 48 hours later punditry held up, and I think it held up pretty well. But one of the things I said was, it seems like there could be an opportunity for the GOP to expel Cruz and Hawley, and they would be replaced by boring GOP politicians who would vote the same way, but wouldn't be giant assholes and like drive everyone crazy. And here's the perfect time for them to do that. That obviously didn't happen. Yeah, so the rank and file deluded people that or the people who thought it was a second American Revolution happening. A lot of those people are suffering consequences and have been you know uh, kept in prison, and sometimes in it's been revealed how how poor like the average federal inmate.
I am hearing that sometimes prisoners are not treated very well in this American system.
Yes,
Um,
so but yeah, so the people who were deluded and fooled into doing this are suffering, but no one at any level of power has
And I guess what troubles me
suffered.
is when you open the New York Times or you open the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, like these are papers of record. And so you look at a Thomas Friedman article like this or anything, these people get these positions that are super unique where they're able to put out into the world, like, what should we ought to do? What are the world of possible options? In some case, I don't want to get into Overton window theory. Everyone who already understands it understands it, and anyone who doesn't can go and Google it. But like, they basically set the contours of what acceptable debate is, and what Friedman, especially in his specific little niche at the New York Times and how he's presented at the New York Times, is giving us is the one option to resist this future, and it sucks. It sucks not only on a policy level, like, and Friedman sort of admits that, like, oh yeah, sure, if we had like a Cheney Harris presidency, it would stink. They wouldn't get anything done. But like, what else are you gonna do? And I think like we need to have other options. I think that these newspaper, like, part of the failure here, the scary thing about 1-6 is that we're not actually thinking bigger. I don't expect the Republicans to transcend themselves. At least I don't. I know a centrist writer does. I don't. I expect the college educated centrist columnists to transcend themselves and realize that, like, there are two parties in this country, and one's actually fundamentally worse, morally speaking, right now, in terms of like how they feel about like elections and stuff, not like policies. I'm not talking about abortion or anything. What is actually worse than the other right now? And just say it. Just say it. Present it as a fact, and the right's going to get upset about it, and they're going to claim liberal media bias. And you know what? It'll be Tuesday. They do that every week. But say the truth. Don't keep
Well,
saying, yeah. Don't
okay,
keep
I will
saying that
say,
these guys.
in defense of in a mild defense of Friedman, he basically says, and perhaps explicitly, the current version, the Trump GOP. I mean, no, I found the line. He says this Trump cult version of the GOP must never be able to retake the White House. So
And
so
that's
he
fine, except that he keeps mitigating that statement with other things that, like, the Democratic Party is. He keeps saying, like, essentially the Democratic Party has gone too far as well. Like, both parties need to chill out, but the Trump GOP should never get back in.
yes, it's sort of, I don't, do you follow that the New York Times PitchBot account? I had the guy on the show last year.
He's quite good.
He parodies this sort of like centrist kind of thing where it's like, you know, um, the Democrats believe in critical race theory, and the Republicans believe in violently overthrowing the government, and we need to condemn both these things equally. Like, that is sort of like an editorial line. But I think Freeman is going farther. He's saying that the current GOP can't, like, it would be a disaster for the country if the Trumpist GOP regains power, and you need to do something to prevent that. His solution, for reasons we've discussed in this episode, would never happen to begin with, and even if it did, it would probably backfire. So something does need to happen that's not happening now. I don't know exactly what it is, but basically I think he did identify the problem in a way that was crystallizing for me. Is Trump a threat to American democracy? Yes. We need to do something different. He doesn't have the answer, but you know,
Oh no,
nothing needs to change.
on this, I completely agree with the establishmentarians that there is actually like a danger with what happened on January 6th. I think their reaction to it has been somewhat maudlin, and or when they come up when they if I take them seriously and go, oh, they actually care, their solutions, like what we discussed here, are just simply not up to the task, which is, and I guess my last thought here is, haven't we tried the centrist president? Aren't we doing that right now? Isn't that like what they sold us all through the Democratic primary? You have to vote for Joe Biden because Bernie Sanders is too left. And what we need right now is a national unity government, not unlike Israel. I feel like I was hearing this during the election. So to hear it now again,
Yeah.
it just, I go, did we learn nothing? Because it was one thing to say that during the election. Then you have the election. You have the centrist guy as the president. He's doing how he's doing. Look at the COVID numbers. And then 1-6 still happens. So if Mr. Centrist guy was actually going to handle this, he would have handled it by now.
Yeah, Biden is, that was the most conservative of the major contenders in the Democratic primary, whereas in 2016 Trump was like the most far right of the contenders, and we saw what happened. Okay, maybe we should end things there because I'm
Sure.
approaching exhaustion. We're recording this late at night, but anything else you want to mention, or plug your podcast and your Twitter and where people can find your stuff?
Absolutely. Okay, so Don't Worry About the Government can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, patreon.com/DWATG. A buck a show is all I ask. If you want to support my work over there at Don't Worry About the Government, I'd love that. Patreon.com/DWATG. if you like professional wrestling, you probably weren't expecting that pitch, people. But if you like professional wrestling, I'm actually on the Voices of Wrestling podcasting network. The other show that I've been doing that has like 500 something episodes is called Shake Them Ropes. You can hear me talk about WWE, like the Ultimate Warrior, baby, shaking them ropes. Talk WWE, AEW, and all the news in the wrestling world every week. That's
Okay, that's
available.
cool. I mean, politics and wrestling became much closer to each other during the Trump years than they were before, and the way that wrestling clarifies what's happening in the world of politics, is important. I think as well.
This was sort of my niche during the Trump administration. There was someone else who basically flanked me and took this, even though I have like a better, not bitter. Like sometimes the internet picks different people, but yeah, no, like that was my prism for understanding the Trump years very much. Wrestling helped me out.
Yeah, I mean, and Trump himself appeared. I mean, I did an episode about this actually with Owen Ellickson in like 2017. Like, I mean, Trump appeared like his friends with
McMahon. Oh yeah.
Vince McMahon and would appeared in various like WWE shows and stuff. And yeah,
no, I mean it's more than that. Vince was running events at the Trump casinos back in the 80s. So way before Trump ever did the run in the aughts where they did the hair versus hair thing with Bobby Lashley. Actually you can see old WrestleManias and other like Royal Rumbles and stuff thrown at Trump casinos. The relationship with the relationship with McMahon goes way back.
Right, and McMahon's wife was in the cabinet, right?
Yes, she was. Yes, she is
like
now a
small
strange
business
wife.
or
Yes.
what? Yeah, small business administration or something. She was given some post also. Yeah, so that, I mean, that's a rich angle, and probably one that Democrats want to study how to defeat a heel. They should.
I'm available, guys. Hit me up. And if you want guitar lessons too, follow me at DWATG or shoot me a message at DWATG. Guitar, bass, music theory, anything you want to learn.
Okay, Chris, thank you for coming on and talking about this with me. People should subscribe to Culture Determined in their podcast feed because very soon after this episode, perhaps immediately after, I'll be leaving the Blogging Heads platform. So if you want to keep on getting this, you need to subscribe to the show individually, either on the YouTube channel, which is Culturally Determined, or podcast feed, on whatever your podcast service is. And yeah, okay. And RACW on Twitter, etc. Okay, so thank you, Chris. Thank you to our viewers and listeners. Will we see you again next time? I guess that's a question. Depends when I'm doing one more of these on Blogging Heads. But either way, thanks for watching, and see ya.